The sun that morning seemed hotter than usual, as if the sky itself knew that something significant would happen that day. Amid the muffled sound of cicadas and the bustling movement of Ouagadougou's streets, a commotion was forming in front of the city's old courthouse. The crowd gathered on the worn marble steps, anxiously awaiting the arrival of a man. This was not just another ordinary hearing. It was the day Ibrahim Traoré would face the country's most feared judge. A man who, for decades, had manipulated sentences, sold justice, destroyed families, and protected the powerful. His name, Charles Lankande. As security guards tried to contain the crowd, the camera follows the slow, steady, and serene steps of Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in a traditional African outfit, embroidered with golden details. His face was stern, his eyes piercing, as if he already knew the outcome of this story before it even began. There was no arrogance in his expression. There was pain, memory, conviction, and a flame that only the righteous carry when preparing to confront injustice. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Charles, already in his place, smirked with disdain. Accustomed to crushing anyone who dared challenge him, he maintained his usual posture: impeccable robe, thin glasses, a gold pen between his fingers, and a gaze as cold as stone. Beside him, 2 government advisors and a military prosecutor observed everything with apprehension. The charges were serious: bribery, evidence tampering, and persecution of the innocent. But it wasn't just that. In that room, before all those witnesses, the true trial was symbolic. A weary people, hidden pain, years of silence on the verge of being broken by someone who never feared looking the oppressor in the eye. When Traoré stood, silence fell over the room. He didn't shout. He didn't gesture. He simply stared at the judge, and then he began to speak. "Your Honor," he said in a respectful yet truth-laden tone, "before anything else, I want you to know that I didn't come here for revenge. I came here for justice, and I came in the name of all those you condemned without even looking them in the eye." The camera focuses on the judge's face, who begins to frown, disturbed by the man's resolve. Exactly 18 years ago, a farmer named Daouda was unjustly convicted of theft. He had 5 children. I was the youngest. That man was my father. You didn't listen to him. You didn't allow his defense to speak. You said the sentence was already decided. He died 3 months later in prison of fever and hunger. Do you remember that? The judge swallows hard, but he doesn't respond. The audience murmurs. Traoré's face remains still, but his eyes glisten with tears he refuses to let fall. "I grew up with hatred," he continues. "I grew up wanting to destroy you. But God taught me something greater. He taught me that true justice is not vengeance. It is truth, and that's what I've come to bring here today. Your truth." At that moment, Traoré hands the court a dossier. Hundreds of pages, cross-referenced evidence, audio recordings, financial transactions, anonymous letters, testimonies. The entire web of corruption surrounding Charles Lankande was there, laid bare in ink, paper, and shame. And behind each document, a forgotten story. An innocent punished, a guilty person set free, a community torn apart. The prosecutor takes the papers, reads the first lines, and his expression changes. He stands, approaches the judge, and with a trembling voice, confirms the authenticity of everything. All of this has been verified. They are irrefutable pieces of evidence. Judge Charles must be immediately removed from his duties. The crowd erupts in a muffled clamor, but Traoré doesn't celebrate. He simply closes his eyes for a moment. A sacred silence hangs over the room, as if every soul present recognizes that this moment is greater than any sentence. It was a spiritual reckoning. But the most surprising part was yet to come. The judge stands, visibly shaken. He tries to maintain his composure, but his hand trembles. He looks around and realizes that for the first time in decades, no one there fears him. No one bows their head. No one calls him Your Honor with blind reverence. All eyes are on Ibrahim. "You," Charles says in a weak voice, "you destroyed me." Traoré steps closer, looks him in the eye from a few inches away, and responds in a low voice, "No, sir. You destroyed yourself the day you traded truth for favors. I only brought the light." That phrase, spoken in a whisper, echoes with devastating force. It's as if time stops for a second. The judge, overcome with a mix of shame, anger, and impotence, tries to react, but cannot. Traoré's words were simple, but cut like a razor. Outside, the news spreads like wildfire through dry grass. The people begin to gather in droves in front of the courthouse. Posters with Traoré's face appear. Women weep. Young people cheer. Elderly men murmur prayers of gratitude. But there was still one last thing to do. Ibrahim turns to the audience and asks to speak again. I didn't come here just to denounce one man. I came to denounce a system, a way of governing that despises the poor, ignores the cries of the villages, turns judges into gods and citizens into slaves of silence. We are better than this. Our people deserve true justice, and true justice can only come from the hands of men who fear God and love the truth. The substitute judge, summoned in haste to take over the case, bangs the gavel with resolve. Immediate removal of Judge Charles Lankande, a case opened for crimes against the state, and public recognition of the innocence of Daouda Traoré, Ibrahim's father. The crowd erupts, but Ibrahim remains still, standing there, eyes closed, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of a lifetime fall from his shoulders, finally relieved. Outside the courthouse, the morning's heat had given way to a gentle breeze filled with expectation. People from the most distant villages were arriving, many on foot, others on makeshift motorcycles, and some even in donkey-drawn carts. What they witnessed that day was not just the end of a corrupt judge's career, it was the beginning of a new collective consciousness. It was the victory of someone who never should have won, but did because he never stopped believing in justice, even when it seemed like a ghost. Ibrahim walked among the people, and the crowd parted before him as if in the presence of a king who never asked for a crown, but earned the throne of the hearts of the righteous. Men greeted him with tear-filled eyes. Women blessed him in ancestral tongues. Children looked at him with pure admiration, as if facing a hero from an ancient tale. And perhaps they were. The press, which had previously ignored him, now fought for a statement. Microphones, cameras, frenzied reporters. But he stopped in front of a young community radio reporter, the only one who, months earlier, had dared to denounce the system. You deserve to hear this, Traoré said, more than anyone. It was your story, the one about the farmer unjustly hanged, that led me to investigate the court's archives. You lit this flame. The young man trembled. He said nothing. He only shook Ibrahim's hand with reverence. Sometimes revolutions are born from small seeds planted in the mud of truth. Meanwhile, Charles Lankande was escorted out of the courthouse, hiding his face with his hands, amid shouts of corrupt and sellout. There was no longer any authority in his robe. He who for decades decided who lived and who died was now just an old man, broken by his own greed. And as he passed by Traoré, their eyes met one last time. Charles tried to say something, but Ibrahim only offered him a look of mercy and turned away. Sometimes forgiveness is more painful than vengeance. That afternoon, an emergency meeting was called by the interim president. Traoré was invited but hesitated. He sought neither positions nor honors, but he understood that the moment required continuity. Upon arriving at the presidential palace, he was received by ministers, generals, and advisors, all visibly shaken. They never expected a simple man without a party or protection to topple one of the oldest pillars of the corrupt power that sustained the elite. Mr. Traoré, said the president, this nation owes you greatly. What do you desire? Anything. A seat on the Supreme Court, leadership of the Anti-Corruption Commission, a title, a position. Tell us. Ibrahim stood slowly, took a deep breath, and replied, I don't want positions. I want a nation where my people can walk with their heads held high. I want judges who don't sell sentences. I want teachers paid with dignity. I want hospitals that function. I want justice to become more powerful than fear. Everyone fell silent. It wasn't a speech. It was a mirror placed before the eyes of men who for years had profited from the darkness. But then a woman stood, the Minister of Justice. She held a sealed envelope in her hands. There's something you need to know, she said, with a trembling voice. The day before the hearing there was an attempt to cancel the session, pressures from abroad, internal blackmail, but something stopped it. Something or someone. She handed the envelope to Ibrahim. He opened it. It was a letter, written by a former court lawyer who had fled years earlier out of fear of reprisals. The letter revealed that, among the dozens of manipulated sentences, one directly affected the interim president's own story. His brother had been unjustly convicted and secretly released shortly before his death. This explained the president's hesitation and his emotional tone. The system had wounded everyone, even those who seemed untouchable. Ibrahim returned the letter and said, "Truth has that power. It arrives like a storm but cleanses everything that was rotten, and where there is cleansing, there is hope." That night, back at his humble home on the outskirts of the city, Ibrahim sat on a wooden bench under a mango tree. The moonlight fell on his face, and the breeze carried the scent of wet earth. His mother, an elderly woman with white hair and a gentle voice, came out of the kitchen with a plate of rice and beans. "You don't have to live here anymore, my son. They offered you mansions. I was born on this ground. This is where I want to sleep. This is where my father taught me to never bow my head." She hugged him from behind, stroking his shoulders as she did when he was a child, and she said, "Your father would be proud." The next day, a new summons. Traoré was invited to speak at the National University. Over 10,000 people were present. Young people hungry for change, student leaders, professors, religious figures, all gathered to hear the man who had challenged the masters of justice with the weapons of integrity. Ibrahim took the stage with his usual calm. Nothing in his demeanor suggested vanity or a desire for applause. He raised his eyes to the crowd and spoke as if addressing the heart of a single person. "When I sat before that judge, I didn't carry hatred with me. I carried my father's memory. I carried the hunger of a people. I carried the pain of mothers who buried children for crimes they didn't commit. But above all, I carried the faith that good can still triumph. I am no more than any of you. I simply refuse to live on my knees." Applause, shouts, tears. The young people clapped and chanted his name, but Ibrahim interrupted them. "Don't shout my name. Shout the name of justice. Shout the name of our people, and never again let fear speak louder than truth." At the end of the speech, hundreds of young people knelt, not in worship of a man, but as a silent pact with the future. There, in that moment, a generation was born that refused to inherit their parents' silence. Later, as he walked alone through the now empty university, Traoré was approached by a blind woman selling cakes at the entrance. She held his hand and said, "I can no longer see my son, but today I felt the light." He knelt before her, took a cake, smiled and replied, "That's because truth shines brighter when it emerges from the darkness." The next day dawned calm, as if nature itself had paused to breathe, but the nation's heart continued to race. The streets, still filled with makeshift murals bearing phrases of justice and images of Ibrahim, seemed to be awakening to a new era. It wasn't just one man who had been judged, it was a system beginning to crumble. And in the midst of this process, Ibrahim Traoré became not a legend, but a living symbol of what the people always wanted to believe, that one man, with courage and truth, can break down the walls of lies. That morning, Ibrahim received an unexpected call. One of Judge Charles Lancande's sons wanted to meet him. Ibrahim hesitated but agreed. He arranged the meeting in an open field, far from cameras, far from the crowd, just the two of them. Upon arriving, the young man, no older than 25, removed his hat with humility, lowered his eyes and said, "My father taught me to fear men. You taught me to respect the truth. I didn't come to ask for forgiveness on his behalf. I came to thank you for not becoming like him." Ibrahim took a deep breath. He approached, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, and replied with serenity, "The sins of fathers don't belong to their children. The future begins when pain transforms into choice. Choose well, young man. Don't inherit the mistakes. Build courage." The young man nodded silently. In his eyes, there was a new kind of tear, not of shame, but of liberation. In the following days, leaders from various African countries sent public messages of support. Some proposed meetings, summits, collaborations, but Ibrahim refused any titles or political positions. For him, the mission was not in the seats of power, but in the dusty ground of forgotten villages. Still, his name grew more powerful, but unlike so many others, Traoré didn't use his name to elevate himself. He used it to lift others. In a small village in the north, where the local school had been closed due to lack of resources, he appeared unannounced. He sat on the ground with the young people, read ancient poems, taught math with pebbles in the dirt, and shared stories of African resistance. Instead of platforms, he built benches. Instead of speeches, he told stories, and each story had an invisible thread weaving together past, pain, resilience, and faith. It was in this setting that an unexpected scene unfolded. An elderly man, thin with a face marked by decades of suffering, approached him, walking slowly with the aid of a cane. He stopped before Ibrahim and said with a trembling voice, "I was one of the jurors in your father's trial. I knew he was innocent, but I stayed silent. I was afraid. I sold my silence." Traoré didn't respond immediately. The wind seemed to freeze the moment. The children, the adults, everyone fell silent. The old man wept. "I'm nearing the end, my son, but I needed to look into your eyes and hear what I don't deserve, your forgiveness." Ibrahim stood. He looked at the man for a few seconds, then he removed the beaded necklace he wore around his neck, the same one he inherited from his father, and placed it in the old man's hands. "When my father was arrested, he told my mother, 'Tell Ibrahim that the world will still have men who choose the light. You didn't choose back then, but you're choosing now. That is also justice.'" The old man fell to his knees, sobbing. And in that moment, in that small village, justice ceased to be just a concept. It became flesh, gesture, redemption. Days later, the Supreme Court validated all the documents presented in the trial. The case was closed with the formal conviction of Charles Loncandé, who would lose all titles, pensions, and benefits. More than that, a new national transparency protocol was established, requiring every judge to have their cases reviewed annually by an independent counsel, an idea proposed by Traoré and embraced by the new minister. But even with the spotlight on him, Ibrahim refused to be seduced. One afternoon, when invited to a major international human rights leaders event, he wrote a letter declining. "As long as there are children without pencils, mothers without food, farmers without land, and judges with fear, I have no right to applaud speeches in brightly lit halls. My place is where the truth has not yet arrived. That's where I'm most needed." The letter was published and became a milestone. Several countries began reviewing their own judicial structures, inspired by the movement that became known as the Ouagadougou Turning Point. Traoré's name transcended borders, but he continued walking barefoot between dust and hope. At the year's end, Ibrahim was invited to a local radio program. The emotional interviewer asked, "After everything you've lived through, everything you've done, what is your greatest victory?" Traoré thought for a moment and replied, "Proving to myself that it's possible to win without getting dirty, that it's possible to face the system without becoming like it, and that forgiveness sometimes means more than justice." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any applause.